Welcome. Thanks for being here. Thanks for taking part to our debate. I am Francesca De Benedetti. I am a journalist. I do cover European affairs at Domani newspaper, where I am a senior editor. And I've been invited as a moderator at this first webinar, which has been organized under the Civil Society Facility for the Mediterranean. We're going to discuss the Euro-Mediterranean trade relations, so let me introduce our speakers very shortly before starting to address our common topic. And get ready to participate because our meeting will be very interactive. We will have polls, we will have room for questions in our charts. You will have the chance to write them, and I guess we will definitely won't get bored. So we have Rikke Menge Jorgensen from the European Commission. She works at the Directorate General for Trade, where she is the coordinator of the regional trade relations with the Union of the Mediterranean. Thanks, Rikke, for being here, of course. Alessia Tibollo is the West Africa Regional Coordinator at COSPE, a nonprofit association that works in 30 countries worldwide. Jeremy Capaldo will guide us through data and facts, given that he is a senior economist at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Last but not least, Monica Di Sisto, which is also a colleague of mine because she's a journalist, but her intervention will be crucial because she's a senior advocacy expert in trade. Before we start analyzing our topic, I want to give the floor to Kristina Prunerova, which is Program Manager at the Directorate General for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations of the European Commission. Kristina, would you mind giving us a short introduction to the project this webinar is framed in? I refer to the Civil Society Facility for the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Francesca. Hello, and welcome to this already second webinar under the Civil Society Facility for the Mediterranean. This is a regional project that enables the structured dialogue of the European Union with the civil society in the southern neighborhood. Originally, it was started already in 2012, but this new phase started in 2023. And under this new phase, together with our 6 framework partners, civil society organizations active in the region, we are preparing various types of interaction among the civil society and the European Union, and such webinar is part of them. We have in total 4 topics covered. It's good governance, it's economic cooperation, migration, and environment and climate. And today's webinar is under the economic cooperation, and the main partner dealing with this is the COSPE organization. And I'm very happy and very curious to hear the interesting speakers today, and I wish you that you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Prunerova. Alessia Tibollo, you are responsible for the Middle East and North Africa Structured Dialogue for COSPE. COSPE is leading the so-called economic cooperation pillar. Could you please give us a short introduction?
Ok, merci. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Juste une petite introduction pour situer les webinaires d'aujourd'hui et pour situer aussi le travail des COSPE. Moi, brièvement, je suis responsable depuis le mois de janvier de la coordination des programmes au niveau de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, mais pendant longtemps, j'étais responsable pour la région Maghreb et je suis la personne qui est en charge un peu du suivi de ce qui est en fait le mécanisme de dialogue structuré pour COSPE, en particulier pour ce qui concerne les volets de coopération économique. Donc, relativement à la thématique des accords de libre-échange de la région MENA, dont on va discuter aujourd'hui, je tiens à partager quelques éléments sur notre positionnement et sur notre vision en tant que COSPE. Depuis plusieurs années, COSPE se positionne à soutien des campagnes contre la libéralisation du commerce international. On a fait partie de la campagne italienne contre les TTIP qui s'opposait à la négociation de l'accord de libre-échange entre l'Union européenne et les États-Unis. On a soutenu la campagne italienne Stop CETA, qui était contre l'accord de libre-échange, encore une fois, entre l'Union européenne, mais avec le Canada. Et nous sommes à côté des organisations de la société civile européenne et maghrébine qui se sont opposées à la conclusion de l'accord ALECA de libre-échange complet approfondi avec, entre l'Union européenne et Tunisie. En tant que ONG qui est active à côté des travailleurs et des travailleuses des différents secteurs, de l'agriculture au textile, pour mentionner des secteurs particulièrement délicats, nous observons au quotidien les impacts sociaux et environnementaux de la libéralisation du commerce dans les pays où nous travaillons. On se trouve dans un contexte général qui est marqué par un système normatif qui protège les droits des investisseurs, qui favorisent la délocalisation, les dumpings sociaux, la concurrence internationale, au détriment des droits du travail et des droits de l'environnement et des droits humains. Donc, preuve en est que le respect de ces mêmes droits dans le cadre des accords de libre-échange demeure avec un caractère purement volontaire, not binding clauses, genre c'est des clauses non contraignantes. Et dans ces contextes, en tant que COSPE, nous touchons des proprement, en particulier en Tunisie, pays où j'habite et je travaille depuis longtemps, les conséquences donc d'une libéralisation poussée. Par exemple, dans le secteur textile, là où c'est demeure principalement occupé et par ce qui est des mécanismes de délocalisation d'entreprises européennes et leur impact en fait sur l'exploitation des ouvriers et surtout des ouvrières parce que c'est un secteur qui est censé en fait avoir une forte composante féminine du travail et donc à être exploité sont surtout les femmes avec des salaires de misère, avec des horaires de travail exténuants, sans aucune protection et sécurité sociale. Comme COSPE, nous sommes à côté donc des luttes de ces travailleurs et de ces travailleuses, principalement dans la filière du textile et dans la filière de l'agriculture. Nous sommes à côté des luttes des activistes et des communautés des pays de l'Amérique latine quand il s'agit de protection de l'environnement et des ressources naturelles versus les intérêts des grandes multinationales, en Équateur comme au Brésil, où les communautés sont souvent victimes d'investissements prédateurs et de confiscation des terres, comme cela se produit quotidiennement en Amazonie. Et parallèlement à l'agenda global sur la commercialisation et libéralisation de l'Union européenne, nous regardons avec préoccupation l'émergence d'une résistance envers des systèmes de traçabilité qui devraient mener à une véritable responsabilité sociale des entreprises face aux abus et au non-respect des droits de l'homme et des instances des communautés. Donc, dans un contexte dans lequel les personnes, les communautés et les territoires sont de plus en plus en danger, pour nous, il est remarquable le travail des activistes environnementaux ainsi que des défenseurs des droits humains qui essayent, dans ces pays, de protéger les droits de leur communauté, préserver les territoires et les ressources naturelles, mais qui sont constamment menacés, soit sous attaque, et plusieurs d'eux ont payé leur engagement avec leur vie. Pour cela, en tant que COSPE, nous avons choisi de participer activement aux instances nationales, aux instances internationales qui défendent les défenseurs des droits de l'homme et qui réclament clairement et résolument un traité sur les droits de l'homme qui soit contraignant pour les entreprises. Dans ce cadre de réflexion, donc, s'insère un peu le webinaire d'aujourd'hui, qui est le premier d'un cycle de 3 rencontres autour de l'analyse de l'impact des accords de libre-échange dans la région MENA. Cette première journée se focalise sur l'impact sectoriel des politiques commerciales européennes, les impasses et les perspectives pour une réorientation potentielle et souhaitée de ces politiques vers une transition juste. Et ces cycles de webinaires, comme elle était en train de mentionner Christine tout à l'heure, s'inscrivent effectivement dans le cadre de ces mécanismes de dialogue structuré Union européenne, société civile dans la région MENA, qui est composé par 4 piliers, gouvernance, migration, environnement et coopération économique, dont nous sommes responsables en tant que COSPE de la facilitation et de l'animation de ce cluster. Et donc, l'objectif d'aujourd'hui, en gros, c'est de créer, de poser des bases pour un échange qui soit un échange ouvert et une réflexion critique sur les questions économiques internationales dans la région méditerranéenne, en mettant l'accent sur l'impact de la libéralisation du commerce et des politiques d'investissement sur les droits des personnes, des communautés et de l'environnement, ainsi que sur les Global Gateway Strategy. Donc, bon, sur cela, je laisse la parole à Francesca qui va nous accompagner dans ce débat et à nos panélistes. Et donc, bon échange à nous et j'espère que ça sera très riche et très franc.
Merci beaucoup Alessia pour ton intervention. Let me now get the European Commission into our discussion. Over the last 14 years, Rikke Menger-Jorgensen has been working on trade policies, specializing in the European neighborhood. She is the coordinator of regional trade relations with the Union for the Mediterranean and responsible for bilateral trade relations with Morocco, Tunisia in the European Commission's Directorate General Trade. Mrs. Menger-Jorgensen, could you give us a short overview of the European Union's trade relations with South Med and Middle Eastern countries, please?
Thank you very much, Francesca, and thank you very much for inviting me to this setting. If I could ask you to share my presentation, then I will indeed start a presentation on the state of play of the EU trade relations with the countries in the MENA and Maastricht regions. Whilst I hope my slides are loading. My presentation will firstly cover relations with the partner countries with which the EU has association agreements that establish free trade areas, something about Turkey, and then with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries indeed. My slide, there we go. No. I'm just going to tells me that I'm talking a different language. So yes, thank you. If you could indeed move to the next slide. Voila. So on this slide, you have an overview of the 8 association agreements when they were signed and when they entered into force, as well as the customs union with Turkey. You will notice indeed here that these agreements are relatively old agreements dating back 20 to almost 30 years. Next slide, please. The so-called Euro-Mediterranean Association Agreements establish bilateral free trade areas. These agreements are very similar in nature, but with certain variations amongst them. There are currently 8 FTAs in place with Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, and Palestine in the South Med region. These FTAs envisage liberalization of trading goods. This means dismantling of tariffs on industrial products and selective liberalization on agricultural products, which are protocols that have been added later on. The FTAs envisage cooperation on investment and services, but they are less far-reaching than those on goods. There is thus a lot of potential for upgrading these agreements to respond to today's challenges indeed, and to offer better opportunities and protection for economic operators. Next slide, please. The southern neighborhood countries are very relevant economic partners for the EU. You see here that with 240 billion euros of trade in 2023, the region remains the 5th largest trading partner of the EU and is 5th biggest export market also for the EU. The EU is the leading trade partner for all of these countries, also important, and it is one of the largest investors with a 149 billion euros of foreign investment stocks in 2022, which are the latest available data that we have. And this is, of course, mainly due to the economic integration between the EU and southern neighborhood partners, which is facilitated by the network of FTAs. Next slide, please. This slide shows you the evolution of trade over the last decade. You will notice that in the last 4 years until 2022, EU trade in goods had a rising trend with the South Med. Both export and imports have been increasing, and the growth rate of South Med export was even higher than the growth rate of EU exports. The slower growth of EU exports could be an indication of the escalating trade barriers in the region and the country's import substitution policies, thus making it difficult for the EU companies to access their markets. The negative trade balance that you notice in 2022 of the EU's negative trade balance is due to high energy prices and increased imports of energy since the outbreak of Russia's aggression on Ukraine. Next slide, please. The EU is equally first trading partner for Turkey, with 206.8 billion euros of trade in goods in 2023. Turkey comes in as the 5th largest trading partner of the EU and is 5th biggest export market for the EU. For the attentive listener, you will have noticed that this is the same ranking as the one that I just mentioned for the South Med countries, but as a region and a comparison, this comes right after. Next slide, please. You mentioned it, I think, Francesco, Alessia. In 2011, the European Commission obtained negotiation directives to start negotiations with 4 of the partner countries, namely Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia, to further update the Euro-Mediterranean FTAs. The scope of this mandate from 2011 was to deepen market access, expand liberalization in agriculture and fisheries, enhance trade and services, foster investment, support economic reforms, improve economic governance, enhance regional economic integration, which are all issues that seem to be very relevant to date. Negotiations were launched with Morocco in 2013 and with Tunisia in 2015, but were, however, stalled in 2019 due to lack of interest by our partners. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, non-tariff barriers remain widespread in the region, both SouthMed and Turkey. These barriers affect not only trade with the EU, but also trade with other third partners, including the interregional Mediterranean exchanges. The European Commission registers known barriers in a database, which is accessible through the EU Commission's Access to Markets website. Currently, we have registered 36 barriers overall for all of the countries, with Algeria and Morocco counting for the highest number, with 11 each for the time being. Some of these barriers are pretty old, dating back almost a decade, which means that we have engaged in dialogue with the relevant authorities in an attempt to convince the countries to either abolish the legislation and/or practices, or to find a solution for EU business. Such barriers concern everything from import licenses to externalized conformity assessment or local content requirements. There are often practices put in place to implement the country's import substitution policies. We also notice a practice of mimicking of barriers across different countries in the Mediterranean, which requires an even stricter approach to removing barriers, as a practice in one country may not affect EU businesses as much as it would in other countries. When it comes to Turkey, however, there is still a relatively large amount of market access issues, with still 15 registered barriers. However, thanks to recent re-engagement with Turkey, this amount has been reduced from 26 in 2021. So good progress there. Next slide, please. So how do we in the European Commission see the potential for enhanced trade in the region? When it comes to economic integration, the region is increasingly involved in the deployment of EU value chains. There's transport infrastructure, natural resources, large young populations, and at least in some countries, developed industrial base. It is well placed to advance nearshoring developments. The southern neighborhood is also an incoming partner in the diversification of EU energy resources and the green and the digital transitions. However, to fully unlock the potential for cooperation, considerable efforts are needed to further enhance the business environment and investments. And this is where the EU is actively involved in dismantling trade barriers. The Commission is also closely engaged with the region to help the countries advancing their internal key economic reforms and resilience agendas. In this regard, the Commission has strengthened the strategic partnership between the EU and the southern neighborhood partners by implementing the ambitious new agenda for the Mediterranean, which includes the dedicated economic and investment plan to spur socio-economic recovery in the partner countries. In this framework, the EU supports regulatory convergence and measures facilitating foreign direct investment to seize the opportunities for uptake of green technologies, notably in renewable energy sectors. This will contribute to sustainable economic growth, employment creation, and the decarbonization of energy systems. The Global Gateway flagship initiative promotes transparent infrastructure partners to meet global infrastructure development needs in the region, as well as regional interconnections. Next slide, please. So how do we see that we can go forward with the SouthMed region? The latest EU trade policy review communication from 2021 states that the EU remains ready to discuss modernizing trade and investment relations with the interested partners in the region. This includes exploring potential sustainable investment facilitation agreements, the so-called CFAs. With a view to further enhance the clean tech industries and to accelerate the green transition globally, cooperation could also involve both energy and raw materials, with a focus on net zero tech supply chains, investments in renewable energy, hydrogen, as well as on trade of energy goods. We are also looking at partnerships with individual partners, such as the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership with Egypt, which was just recently signed last week, which will relaunch bilateral engagement with Egypt and support Egypt's economic stability through an extensive EU financial program for its external economic and structural reforms covering trade and investments, as well as green initiatives. We also have the strategic partnership with Tunisia, which was signed last year in July, covering the possible modernization of trade relations. Finally, there is also discussions with Morocco that will build upon the current Green Partnership MOU from 2022 to further develop bilateral cooperation on improving the business environment and renewable energy. From a regional perspective, the southern neighborhood counterparts are also involved in initiatives under the Union for the Mediterranean, and they benefit from regional cooperation projects funded by the EU under the so-called Team Europe initiative, which is called Jobs Through Trade and Investment. And this will soon implement 2 newer programs on green economy and e-commerce or digital trade, supporting the green and digital transition. Next slide, please. So on Turkey, which is separate from obviously from the SouthMed region, initially the Commission proposed to modernize the customs union and further extend it in December 2016. However, this proposal was never validated by the EU member states, as you surely know. However, engagement continues, and the EU-Turkey relations are currently framed by the June 2021 European Council conclusions that, as it states here, underlines the EU's readiness to engage with Turkey, at the time now Turkey, in a phased, proportionate and reversible manner to enhance cooperation in a number of areas of common interest subject to the established conditionalities. Furthermore, in November 2023, so more recently, a joint communication on the state of play of the EU-Turkey relations stated that a number of measures to reinvigorate the relations, including strong conditionality, could go ahead. Therefore, DG Trade has started an EU-Turkey high-level trade working group to explore cooperation areas, discuss sanctions circumventions, and trade barriers, amongst others. Next slide, please. So I will just now quickly take you through a renewed engagement with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, if you allow. Next slide, please. Because also here we see there is a great interest from the EU in fostering closer engagement with members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, especially in the aftermath of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The new drivers for EU stronger cooperation with the Gulf region is to seek energy independence from Russia, to seize trade and investment opportunities amidst rising inflation, and to face common security challenges. These objectives have been reflected in the EU strategy on the Gulf from May 2022, and also the Gulf partners themselves have expressed interest in joining forces with the EU in those areas, as confirmed by the discussions in the latest EU-GCC Joint Cooperation Council of October 2023. EU-GCC relations are otherwise based on an old agreement, a cooperation agreement from 1988. A more structured and formal EU-GCC dialogue on trade and investment was launched in 2017, which established yearly bilateral senior officials meetings with individual countries, including a working group on trade issues. And in addition, there is a regional EU-GCC trade and investment dialogue. And finally, there is a recent EU-GCC economic diversification project, which is an instrument to support joint initiatives for the stability of the respective business and investment environments, removal of barriers, and cooperation on regulatory frameworks and standardization. Next slide, please. The 6 member countries of the GCC represent an important region from a trade and investment point of view. They are all high-income countries with a significant purchasing power and a wide variety of growth areas, which distinguishes them, of course, from many of the South Med region countries. The GCC countries is an export destination for many EU brands, and EU products have good reputation and tariffs are relatively low to export to the EU, to the GCC countries. The countries are seeking economic diversification, transitioning from the traditional hydrocarbons into renewable energy investments, which provide for a great potential for EU businesses. The countries provide for large-scale projects, including on high-tech infrastructure and construction. And this requires new technologies in a sustainable way where the EU has the know-how. Next slide, please. The GCC region is the EU's 7th largest export market with 93 billion euros in 2023. In 2022, trade amounted to 175 billion, and in 2023 to 170 billion euros. And this is a record high trade with the GCC. The EU registers a favorable trade balance with the region in addition. According to our latest data, the EU is the 2nd biggest trading partner of the GCC after China. We still do not have the latest figures from last year, but that's the way it looked like in 2022. The GCC is also a significant source of investment for EU member states with 227 billion euros of FDI stocks in the EU in 2022. Next slide, please. In particular, new investment opportunities arising from the green and digital transitions will be key for the integration of the EU-GCC economies. This covers areas such as energy, renewables, environment and water, financial services, healthcare, and even space, where they are advanced. However, in order to strengthen trust and confidence in the digital world, there is a need to discuss key issues like privacy, data security, the use of artificial intelligence, and e-commerce. Next slide, please. As with the South Med countries, there is a need to further facilitate investment flows. Especially Asian countries constitute an important competition for entering into the GCC markets. And here we have especially India apparently coming in and providing for competition. And in particular in this reading, establishing a personal professional relationship is essential to securing contracts. We have noticed through our contacts. Market access barriers here also cover especially non-harmonized GCC regulations and standards across the region, which constitutes a problem economic operators would like to have the standardized across the region, but apparently they differ. Also, the IPR enforcement is weak, especially in transit of counterfeit goods. And in addition, participating public procurement procedures likewise presents obstacles through many localization requirements, which comes through their policies of known as Saudization, Emiratization, and Omanization. I cannot even pronounce this, but anyway, it means local content requirements in the government procurement. And the very last slide, please. So, as to the way forward, the GCC partners, both the EU strategy on the Gulf and the Council conclusions that dates back from 2022 envisage to explore the possibility of negotiating bilateral agreements with individual GCC member states. And on this basis, we're currently in DG Trade, European Commission across the board, engaged in a formal dialogue with the partners to find a common ground. And this concludes my intervention, which I hope has spread a bit of light on the work that we do with the European Commission with the countries in the South Mediterranean and Gulf Cooperation countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It has been really useful and interesting. Now I want to trigger some participation from our audience. We have a poll, which is somehow related to your speech. I ask please to show it. Okay. So which areas should the EU focus on in the next commission? Because, you know, we're going to have elections in June. So which areas should the EU focus on regarding its trade and investment policies with the southern neighborhood countries? You can, of course, start voting because we have only about 40 seconds for the vote. In the meanwhile, I'm reading the 5 options. The first one is enhanced regional integration. The second one is more bilateral inclusive strategic partnerships. The third is green transition. Fourth, digital transition. And the fifth one, dismantling of barriers and regulatory convergence. So please pick up your choice. I'm gonna do it too. And we will see the results as soon as the 40 seconds have passed. Okay, so it seems that the first option is enhanced regional integration with the 38%. Then we have the green transition, 31%. Our audience also considers important to dismantle barriers and to have a regulatory convergence. It is the 25%, and no one voted for the digital transition, while we have a 6% which encourages more bilateral inclusive strategic partnerships. So the audience wants integration and green transition. Thank you very much for giving us your opinion. Given that we now had a few data from the audience, but I also want to involve Geronimo Capaldo, which has the data about the topic itself. Capaldo has written extensively about the impacts of global trade expansion on employment, inequality, and development. And I expect from him that he shares interesting data with us, given that he researches the macroeconomic linkages between climate policy, trade, and development with the help of global econometric models. So I give the floor to Geronimo Capaldo, which is a senior economist at UNCTAD. Please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just gonna pick out my slide here. It should be yeah, okay. Do you see it in full screen? Yeah, okay. So I am thankful to Rike's presentation for clearly illustrating how rich the picture of the various trade agreements are between the EU and the region. And this is a very important starting point while we try to understand what trade relations look like in understanding all the pieces. But the question that then we have to ask is this a desirable state of affairs? Are these forms of trade integration, liberalization, or agreements of various kinds, are they desirable for the countries involved? And the perspective here is, can be, the perspective that can be chosen can really vary. But given that the countries, the partner countries here are all at much earlier stages of development than the EU. They're all what we consider in the EU, they're all developing countries. The question that matters, I think, is, are these forms of integration desirable from the standpoint of development? Are these going to contribute to development, or are they going to stand in the way of development? Are they going to accelerate it? Are they going to make it fairer? And what are they going to do for the shared goals, which are the ones of climate stabilization to start with? Now, to start figuring out an answer to this, one has to typically use a bunch of models that try to put together, as many details as possible, and then figure out what the impact of these regulatory changes are going to be on some key economic variables: employment, income, and etc. And that's possible, but and that is done actually all the time. The controversies there are several, because of course the models differ widely depending on the assumptions that they have embedded in them. And so you have models that assume very important pieces of reality away, and then there are other models that assume other relations as the fundamental descriptors of the economies involved. And so in the end, it becomes very often a controversy between visions of what matters and for a technical economic analysis. It's very hard to get out of it. I have my preferences, and I'm going to mention that in a little bit. But I think what's important to realize is that we don't necessarily need models full of assumptions to make progress in this sense, and to try and understand what a type of analysis could be that would lead us towards an answer of that question: are these forms of integration desirable from the point of view of development? And one way to carry that out is to do a sector level analysis of the economies involved. And this is very important, because once we do that, we realize that all these economies, and I unfortunately I don't have empirical cases to bring other than the case of Turkey, which is sort of tangential in this, but it's still meaningful. All of these economies have an important feature. They're all split into two areas. There is an area of more advanced, more dynamic sectors where where productivity is higher and wages are higher, and therefore they're paid out at higher rates. And then an area of stagnant sectors where productivity is lower and wages are lower. Now, this is everywhere in the world, but the problem with these economies, and unfortunately this is a problem with many advanced economies too, is that in the last 30 years, we've seen a shift such that the stagnant economies are producing a smaller and smaller share of the total value added in the economy, while employing a larger and larger share of people. In other words, workers are moving from the dynamic sectors where they get the high wage payments into the stagnant sectors where they get low productivity activities and low wage jobs. And as a result of this, the amount of aggregate demand that these workers can express as consumers, as households, and the residential investments they make and all the spending that they are able to afford, ends up being insufficient to sustain the growth of the economies themselves. So there is a shift that makes the growth model of these economies not durable, or not something that can be counted on, which is why very often then there's all this emphasis on trade, because we can't really figure out we can't really make our growth durable, but through our domestic dynamics, then we look for trade that is an external force that can carry out into positive growth territory. But while this is something that creates some problems, but can be resolved for advanced economies, it is a particularly pernicious problem for developing economies, because developing economies badly need the opposite trend. They badly need the type of structural change that in fact favors the more dynamic sectors. And it's particularly one dynamic sector that is really, really fundamental in this, and that is manufacturing, because manufacturing has this one key feature that allows for the sustained growth of incomes, but also for sustained structural change, and that's what we call increasing returns. So manufacturing is the type of activity where, as the scale of production increases, then either the cost decrease proportionally or more than proportionally, or the revenues increase more than proportionally. And as a result, the value added that is created increases with the scale. And now, this is what allows developing countries, and what has allowed successful developing countries or former developing countries that have developed, including the current members of the EU, is what allows countries to make the investments they need to really change their productive structure in a way that sustains growing standards of living. Now, when we do this, and so if we embark in this analysis, then what we want to find is that the countries involved are, if they are, as they are, subject to this negative shift towards more stagnant activities, what we want to find is that the trade agreements that are proposed, in fact, help prevent this trend rather than encourage it. And so the latest case that I could get my hands on with data is the one for the EU-Mercosur agreement, which is interesting because it gave me the opportunity to look into the economy of Turkey more carefully. And I apologize for not changing the name. It somehow proved incredibly difficult, which it shouldn't have been. But what we see here is that, so for example, the size of the stagnant economy between the early 21st century and 2014, the size of the stagnant economy in terms of value added decreased by more than 10%, while its employment share increased by more than 7%. So you see a massive transfer of labor towards a sector of the economy that really cannot produce much value added, where productivity growth is scarce and wage payments are low. We cannot expect the prospects of development to be strong in such a situation. And here there's a list of the sectors that are more or less dynamic. And unfortunately, when we look at the terms of many of the agreements that Turkey is involved in, we realize that there is a pattern that shows up that is a very known pattern in which the stagnant sectors, the ones with low productivity, especially the commodity sectors, are the ones that tend to benefit the most from these forms of trade integration. And the problem with that is that expanding the commodity sector or the agricultural sector has, in fact, detrimental consequences from a macroeconomic perspective for the economies involved, as is the case for Turkey, but also for many other countries. And the reason for that is that at some point, when a sector cannot count on increasing returns, the expansion of its scale generates income concentration to very undesirable levels, and it generates overexploitation of resources in a way that is also undesirable. So once we look into this and we crunch all this data, then we realize, okay, well, there's really two areas in these economies, and one area is an area that has some promise, but it's not the area that we necessarily look to expand thanks to these market access that we're offering these countries. There are areas, in fact, that are more stagnant, which are the commodities and primary exports areas, that are going to expand their business. But unfortunately, the spillovers from these stagnant areas to the dynamic areas, and therefore the prospects of development, are very small. And there's in the study on the EU-Mercosur, you can find all the details. But no matter how I slice this, whether I look at productivity growth, I look at wages, I look at the profit, the composition, at the employment share, what I find is that all the sectors that the various agreements that Turkey is involved in are supposed to expand are the sectors that won't really do much for Turkey's development. And now it seems to me that this is a pitfall that one one has to take very seriously, because the problem that we run into is one where we are going to integrate the world across some areas, but we're going to make, again, as we've done often in the past, we're going to make an area macroeconomically dependent on another area. And in particular, this is the case. This is the risk that we run when we integrate an industrial power with a commodity producer. They will exchange these goods that they are specialized in, and what that will do, it will enhance what we call their comparative advantage, or the gifts that they already have, but it will not help them. It will not help the developing economies move into a sectors of activity where they can develop new quote unquote gifts or new advantages. So development ends up being stunted. And now, as I've mentioned, one can take these analyses, which are purely statistical. There's no modeling in there to get a sense of where the vulnerabilities are. I think it'd be important to do it in a systematic way, and I don't see that often enough, unfortunately. But it is an analysis that, for example, was tremendously common in Korea in the 70s and 80s, and it's something that guided the type of resource allocation that made Korea the industrial powerhouse it is today. But when we look at them, I'm going to conclude here. When we look at the assessment of these, the prospects of these agreements, then we can do it with this purely statistical analysis. We can do it with the modeling analysis. But if we go with the modeling analysis, then we have to be careful not to exclude some of the key problems that we need to explain. And which, unfortunately, this is in my field, it is something that happens way too often. So the standard approach to these analysis is one in which we, for example, pretend the inequality is not there. These models are not capable of generating any trend in inequality. But inequality is a fundamental feature and a fundamental threat in economies that are based on the primary sector, because the primary sector leads to high concentration of income and wealth. And so there needs to be, I think, a change of approach there to make sure that these projects of trade expansion don't end up working as obstacles to the development of the countries involved. And at that point, the perspective might change. Even the non-tariff barriers, which are, from the approach of the standard models, are clearly what stands in the way of better economic efficiency, might not be necessarily a big deal. For example, with my colleagues, we were just crunching the numbers for 2024 for the China-EU relations, and we see that China's imports from the EU are falling very, very rapidly. And we know that this is because the EU has made it a priority to limit the exports of certain strategic goods to China. That's a non-tariff, a form of non-tariff barrier, but it's something that's considered entirely legitimate because it serves certain purposes. And so prioritizing development can be made into an important barrier if we want to see it that way, but it's also a very desirable goal in my book. Thank you. Sorry to make this longer.
Thank you very much. So last but not least, I'm giving the floor to Monica De Sisto. She plays a role in coordinating the Economic Justice Track and the Labor Task Group of the Italian C7 and C20. Those are the civil society sides of the G7 and G20, of course. She's responsible for the Italian Trade Observatory FairWatch, and so on. To be short, she's a long-time expert in trade and international cooperation. Please, Monica, take the floor.
Thank you so much, Francesca. It's very difficult to put my intervention after Rick and Jeronimo, but I'll try to do my best. In particular, in trying to highlight the point of view of civil society and trying to tell this story because I'm old, so it's more than 20 years that I'm trying to advocate trade justice. And I think, and we think, that now it's time to change, and the big changes has to be done in the EU agenda. And I would like to use this opportunity to reconstruct the trajectory of European trade policies, very quickly understand what the current directions and trends have been, and then focus on the never fulfilled need to close the cycle of policy coherence for sustainable development. We both reflect about it a lot, about in the C20, about the sanitary agenda, if you remember, Francesca, and then share some proposals that have been on the table for some times and report new concerns. So I want to go down very quickly, next please, on the EU trade agenda and NE6. Sorry, may I have my next slide? Yeah, thank you so much. And it started to restructure commercial cooperation relationships between the EU members and their former colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Mediterranean area. But it has undergone various stages in Yaoundé, and then Lomé from the 70s to the new millennium. And those agreements were characterized by the consideration of very practical and historical responsibilities, and so the relations were totally asymmetric. And this asymmetry, please, the next one, has been changed, and this asymmetry has been need to be changed after the consideration made by the WTO that the non-reciprocal duty-free access for ACP products into the EU market was a violation of the new trade liberalization rules enforced by WTO. So the new agreements had to be fully WTO compatible, and these changes in the political framework led to the proposition of a new way to organize our trade relationships through EPIAs, so economic partners agreements. And those, next slide, please. And those are in a very different direction from where we decided to organize our relationships in the past, because the EU was a zealous defender of the non-reciprocal preference, in particular at the Mediterranean level. We can imagine that is because the partners in Mediterranean area and the ACP were not putting competitive pressure at EU producers, but this way to trade, taking into account our roots, our histories, and our historic relationships, had the capacity to make this trade flow grow and to establish a peaceful relationship between the two areas in the Europe and the Mediterranean area since very recent timing. And next one. The Cotonou Agreement, the agreement that introduced and created the legal basis for EPAs, has as its basis the poverty reduction and eventual eradication, but it should be consistent with the gradual integration of ACP countries in the world economy, so-called liberalization. The obligation had to be mutual, so the new agreements provides deep and comprehensive new relationships with open to new sectors and open to the pressure of our producers to the local markets. It has been not that enabling for, in particular, the transformation at local level, as Jeronim showed very well with this his study on Turkey, and the new relationships included a political dialogue on human rights, democracy, rule of law, and good governance. But in the table, around the table, we had new actors, civil society, of course. This is a good change, a big change, but also private sector. And private sector included and helped to shape the requirements of several of these meetings or of these agreements, as we foresee and we realized having a role, an active role in those negotiations, directly or indirectly supporting our partners in the comprehension in the negotiation. Next one, please. So we had in the other, in the one side, the new economic partnership agreements, not that well accepted since the beginning from our partners, in particular trade unions, in particular small-scale producers, in particular women's organizations that feared the impact that they started to assess. And on the other end, they had open in front of them two new ways and two new perspectives. The one, the regional integration of the African area, the Africa Union process, and the new free trade areas introduced by the African Union as a tool to accelerate South-South and in particular regional trade. That has been a growing and more important opportunity at local level, and is now an open windows, a possibility of different development at local level that several of those countries and of those governments are trying to play at the best in their capacity. Next one. As civil society, we always advocated for rule-based trade policies on a global level to help to shape globalization, realizing sustainability and allow for a fair development. Since 2011, we obtained the introduction of the DAGs, of the Domestic Advisory Group, participated by civil society, that are being tools and spaces for participation, but that allows us to keep in mind the aspect of sustainability, to monitor the implementation of the standards. But at the very end, we have just 11 of 32 agreements, bilateral agreements introduced by the EU that provides DAGs, and the other ones have small or no spaces and regular spaces of discussion between the parties that includes civil society and trade unions in the discussion. Next, please. And the relationships between EU and the Mediterranean, but also the other trade partners, has been populated since then by several different levels of relationships: association agreements, memorandum of understanding with only one region or only one partner, or signed by some members of the EU with some partners, and this is a jeopardized the level of confrontation that we can have and the space that we can create and open to discuss the development issues and the impact of trade flows. And since 2023, we are working in the Samoa Agreement, that is the new overarching framework for the EU relationships with 79, if I remember correctly, African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, around 2 billion peoples. And this is a new framework based on 6 areas: democracy, human rights, sustainable economic growth and development, climate change, human and social development, peace and security, migration, and mobility. And we are negotiating now the way and the spaces, the more appropriate space for civil society, trying to avoid the old mistakes we did. Then the new agreement was signed in November 2023, so it's very recent, and the discussion are undergoing mainly in the DG, and this is one of the problems that we highlight later, the fact that very often the different DG are working in silos and not taking into account transversally the development dimension in their different dossier and their different relationship with the same countries. So this is a problem quite important. And to accelerate, I'll jump the next one and I'll arrive to the next two. Another one, please. The next, yes, yeah. And in the different fora that we and agreement that we are monitoring, we found several different problems in protecting human rights. For instance, the trilateral memorandum with Egypt and Israel, several organizations of the civil society, together with the International Federation for Human Rights, we indicated that this memorandum is at the root of the far-reaching process of fragilization of communities and ecosystems across North Africa and beyond, because they are focused on the extraction of minerals, raw materials, critical raw materials, or energy raw materials, or agricultural raw materials. And the center is the European development. And of course, we are European citizens, but we cannot take into account the actual imbalance and the actual growing conflicts between those areas, in particular due to social and labor injustice that are unfortunately generating along the long supply chains governed and also controlled by multinational or groups that are based in the EU. They are not the only, the only bad guys in the panorama, but we are part of the problem. So we as a civil society want to be part of the solution. Next, please. And in the free trade agreement that we signed with South Korea, we and since then we have the introduction in the trade agreements of specific chapters dedicated to trade and sustainable development. Those are not binding, quite interesting, useful for us to advocate, but at the very end, in the hands of the DAG, they are really, really difficult to manage, and also to manage in order to obtain concrete changes in the worst impact of the new trade flows or the new trade mechanism introduced with the treaties. And with the new, the more recent EU-New Zealand FTAs, some changes has been introduced, as the extension of state-to-state dispute settlement also to the sustainable development chapter, the possibility to use trade sanction if we find some violation of the Paris Climate Agreement or the fundamental principles of ILO. But the problem of asymmetry and of participation stay there on the table, because how small-scale producers, how affected social groups, how women in particular can be heard in those fora, where us as EU civil society are in deep difficulties to be consistent and present and effective in our action. Next. And we recall what UNCTAD asked to our governments immediately after COVID as priority, as an economic priority. They state that that a caring community was needed to protect the vulnerable population and promote economic rights. And this was not, you know, a way to share pity or to have, you know, an ethical improvement of our common understanding, but was a way to rebuild our markets and our economic relationships after a huge shock as COVID has been. But it has not been the case, unfortunately. And what we are foreseeing is a growing conflict. Next, please. That, of course, is generated by the new organization of the digital supply chain, of the most modern industrial supply chain, because in the schemes we have very small margins for the countries that are sources of raw materials, of components, of very low value or low valued segment of the supply chains, and the most important and most relevant margins are in the hands of the coordinator of the supply chains, that are very often not in the development world, but they are in our countries. Next. And so what do we believe? We believe that we have more than ever to strengthen the policy coherence of sustainable development, the cycle of policy coherence in the EU agenda. We started to advocate on that since 2015, and we ask always the same things. We ask to foster synergies across policy areas and between sectors, to ensure that today's policies do not undermine the well-being of sustainable development of future generations, to identify what Jeronim clearly identified in his presentation, the trade-offs, the negative spillovers in the domestic policies and in the trade and in the international policies, with a particular attention to participation. Next. And we advocate for a balanced and comprehensive and integrated approach to sustainable development in EU policy making. And we think that it is not possible to achieve it without the creation of effective spaces for participation by civil society organizations, ensuring relevant connection with local communities, both in the north than in the south. And we need to, and also the European Commission acknowledged in 2019 that we had no clear, we don't have a clear mandate to guarantee PSD, and to decide on trade-off and align internal and external policies in the framework of the 2030 agenda. Some attempt of correction has been made. The next. And the next, and then we come back to this one. Also, the European Parliament acknowledged that the Commission reinforced the chapters on sustainable development in trade agreements, that they tried to streamline the sustainability through the free trade agreements, but they ask a better support and a stronger support for the role of the domestic advisory groups, stress the importance of carrying out ex post assessment of environmental and social impact of all provision of FTAs, and underlines that the multilateral action is the best way to achieve the global transition to a carbon neutral, inclusive and sustainable economy. The previous one and then the latest one, so I end my presentation. The previous one, please. And no, the next one. Sorry. Yes. Policy coherence is not something that is rooted in our souls or in our religions, but is rooted in the Article 208 of the Lisbon Treaty and has been reiterated since then in the European Consensus on Development and in several legal frameworks of the EU and of the EC and supported by the EC Parliament. What we need to realize in the perspective of an effective policy coherence related to trade. We need an ongoing participatory process of multidimensional impact evaluation, not just of trade action, but also at aid for trade, aid for development, and all the ODA action in order to address all the different activities ongoing in the same countries, because otherwise we don't have an effective governance of the different action at EU level and at members level, but in particular on trade that is delegated to the EU in the trade dossier. We need a multi-DG governance and a permanent members' consultation on the evolution of trade policies in particular, but with an eye to all the development policies that and aid for trade and aid for development that EC and its members are implementing. An evaluation and effective measures against the concentration of market opportunities influence and against corporate capture of legal and process implemented by the EC and the EU, and accountability on evaluation with effective remedies in place in order to address any problems that we can find in the development of this and in the implementation of these treaties on the field, in particular in dialogue with our partners. The latest slide, please, so I can conclude. The last one. Another one. Yes, those are, no, the previous one. Those are our main new and growing concern. What about multilateralism? Since the beginning of 2000, we started to advocate, to envisage the idea that WTO had to shrink its competencies or sink. This is something that we foresee also at bilateral level. EU is trying to expand the negotiation, expand their possibility to regulate together with its partners several fields, from energy governance to digital development. We think that this is a very is a way for the disaster, and we need to shrink the agenda to the essential, regain confidence, rebuild partnership that can be authentic partnership with occasional opportunities for all the partners, and then we could building on that. But in this specific moment, I think we don't have the policy space and the policy confidence. We adjusted the strength that we can play with according with the dependencies that we create along the long history of relationships we developed with our former colonies. But I think that colonialism is over, and we need to think seriously about our common future. The second point is reshoring and friendshoring. We need to shorten the global supply chain. This is nothing, so strange or so uncommon. This is something we advocate since 10 years, so more or less. But and the level of complexity in the globalization environment is such that we cannot rely on the things that are on the other part of the world. But how we will reshore and who will be our friends, I think it will be key to shape our future and our security as well. CBAM and all the measures that we are implementing to protect our environment, our workers, how can we shape them and evaluate them with our partners in order not to transform them in weapons, but in shared measures that can be expanded and that can be shared with our, maybe in the Mediterranean area, and not to create another problem of trade barriers for our partners or our new friends, if we have to friendshore our supply chains, are how to enforce the new due diligence on the longer supply chain that as European Union we are implementing, where we just approved, is half the due diligence we wanted as a civil society. But also this part, I think, can be useful in order to protect human rights of people that now are voiceless. And a very concerned and latest remark I want to raise about the Green Deal. Yesterday, we had a dialogue in Brussels between the Commission, the Parliament, the trade unions, and enterprises. What about civil society? What about their partners? What about this largest world, this global world that was our horizon until 3 or 4 years ago? I think that if we damage the Green Deal or its ambition without any gain at the level of social security and human rights affirmation, I think that we will damage the future of our children. Fortunately and luckily, I don't have children, but I think that who has them needs to take these choices in this field very carefully and examine them with the possibility to enlarge the table, the point of view, the voices as much as we can, to be the democratic power that we envisage when we create the European Union. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Monica. You underlined the importance of participation, so this is the good moment to start with our second and last poll. Please, let's show the the second poll. And well, you can see this is about participation. Monica talked in her speech about the so-called domestic advisory group, which is the DAG. So you now can understand what the question is. Have you ever taken part in DAG panels consultation processes on trade agreements? You can pick up yes, no, or no, but would like to. So we have a few seconds to fill the poll, and then we can share the results. And by the way, while we wait, I also encourage our audience to write questions, because we still have not any question, but it will be good to hear from you what you're interested about, so that we can really promote a good debate. Please, let's see the results. Okay, so it seems that most of us in the audience have never participated to a DAG panel consultation process. 67% answered no, 22% would like to, even if they did not, and the 11% said yes. Thank you very much for taking part to the poll. So at the moment, I think we have to share a bit of a debate. I want to start with the European Commission, with Rikke Menger-Jorgensen. Well, you know, Monica underlined the importance of having feedbacks from the civil society. And of course, we take for granted that we have the European Parliament, which is somehow monitoring what's happening. But I can also see that there is a kind of newest generation of agreements. We have seen the Memorandum of Understanding with Tunisia. We have seen the latest deal with Egypt. And I can see that there is a huge ambition, because if you look at the agreement with Egypt, you see there are 6 pillars of intervention. You have trade, but you also have political relations, economic stability, and so on. This seems to be very ambitious. But at the same time, I can see that Brussels is somehow trying to use emergency leverages, because, you know, the ratio is the situation in the third country requires urgent financial assistance. So we have a huge deal, but we have short time, and even an effort to exclude the European Parliament from a real debate about these issues. So my question for you is, which kind of accountability can we have with this kind of new tools? How do you plan to ensure that the European Parliament and the civil society are adequately involved?
Thank you very much, Francesca, for this very interesting question and very interesting presentations as well for my fellow panelists indeed, and raises a lot of interesting questions that I have taken note as well, and will take it in further reflection here as well. I think we need to see this from a little bit broader perspective. I mean, the EU has been challenged to the core over the past recent years with migration crisis due to the civil war in Syria back in 2011, the COVID-19, Russian aggression against Ukraine, new migration issues, a flare of conflict in the Middle East, and continuous illegal migration from Africa. And I think in that context, Brussels is indeed using emergency leverages because they are needed. However, the ones that you mentioned, I think they're perhaps less emergency leverages, but a bit more of an acknowledgement of the need for a more strategic approach to engage with our partners. If we take the example of the MOU that was signed with Tunisia last year, indeed, it came in a context and in response to a surge of illegal migration from Tunisia. But then it was decided also to take this opportunity to indeed engage further with Tunisia and come to an agreement which would commit both partners to collaborate in a broad range of areas, as you mentioned, beyond migration, such as agriculture, circular economy, air transport, investment, green energy, and obviously trade. You mentioned then what is the engagement of the EP and the European Parliament and civil society. In the drafting of the Memorandum of Understanding, it was indeed debated regularly with the European Parliament. at several occasions in various committees and plenaries and a high-level geopolitical dialogue. In addition, as per the legal basis as an agreement, of course, they are also officially informed on the financing decision. So there is kind of, let's say, there's one side of implementing policies, but then also, of course, the part of the financial assistance. The EU is already working a lot with this civil society organizations in Tunisia, and particularly in Tunisia, actually, on the bilateral, thematic, and regional budget lines with ongoing programs. For instance, I understand on Oxfam, Avocats Sans Frontières and the Forum Tunisien pour le droit socio-économique to support in emerging civil society actors. And this is a long-standing tripartite dialogue that the EU has with, in particular, Tunisia. When it comes to the trade pillar of the Memorandum of Understanding, there is no direct financing involved. There is a little bit on the investment part where there will be a business in EU-Tunisia business or investment forum to be organized, and there's a little bit of co-financing from the EU side. But in terms of further engagement on trade, the EU is committed to promote and enhance the modernization of the framework for trade and investment relations in order to improve market access conditions. That is the wording of the MOU. And this is where indeed we see that there may be an opportunity to either upgrade the old association agreement. Why not to include the trade and sustainable development chapters? Indeed, I think there's ample a possibility to do that and scope to do that. Or we could enter into perhaps, and as I mentioned early on, discussions on a sustainable investment facilitation agreement, which is also has provisions on the sustainability issues on labor and climate and energy. And of course, why will we do this? I mean, we would then, if we are going to go through this process, we will of course use the same processes, the same consultation processes with civil society and the European Parliament, as we do in normal negotiations. If we take the example of the joint declaration which was signed last Sunday in Cairo between the Commission President and the Egyptian President Assisi, that one intends to formulate and cite an inclusive document on comprehensive and strategic partnership. And this again is done in acknowledgement of enhanced sectoral cooperation in many areas, right from energy, sustainable investment, trade, food security, climate change, and of course then to counterterrorism and migration. Again, same thing, the document and the roadmap that will then implement this declaration will also be debated in the European Parliament, and any financial assistance that goes hand in hand with this partnership will also follow the same consultation procedures as with the Tunisian MOU. What is a bit specific perhaps on the strategic partnership with Egypt as compared to the Tunisia one is there is, I'm not sure that we call them conditionalities, but there is in return, let's say, for the financial assistance that will be given on the microfinancial assistance that will be giving, and there is requirement for institutional reform and regulatory convergence that the EU expects from Egypt, and that perhaps will also sort of help to get a closer relationship between the two, and ultimately upgrade the Egyptian, let's say, governance and economies. Here again, also on the trade side, the parties will explore various forms for the modernization and review of the association agreement on trade and investment relations to better adapt them to today's challenges. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we have our communication that where we say that we indeed are open to any modernization whether it be upgrading of the current agreements, or specific CFAs would be a possibility. And again, here, I mean, of course, the same monitoring will be done. Consultation process will be followed as with the Tunisia MOU. Voila, I think that clarifies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if the other speakers want to say something about this issue, accountability and involvement of civil society. Otherwise, I will propose a question to Monica, because I can't ignore that we have the European elections in June. So I'm wondering if we, and you in particular, have something to say about which the priorities should be, you know, for what concerns the future, the upcoming EU Parliament and the Commission. We have the privilege to have Rike here. She can listen to us and to our suggestions. So Monica, do you have any?
Yes, but the Commission at the technical level is amazing. They do whatever they can in order to better implement the instruments and the measures that are agreed at political level. But my point is more political, because we have tractors on the street, we have factory closing, jobs that are increasingly precarious and poor, and the environment that is under pressure all around the Mediterranean. So I believe that facing the election, the European Union must present is her better, shape, and because if the European Union present itself to the rest of the world, or continue to present itself to the rest of the world as just one of the many trading partners, without its rights, its history, the unauthentic green agenda, sincerely democratic and fair way to create relations, it will be increasingly lose its centrality. This is my prevision. Maybe I'll be disconfirmed just tomorrow, but I think the EU and now we are looking into that with numbers, and I suggest to put always the numbers about the value of our trade together with the volumes of our trade, because we have amazing projections of the latest years. But if you check the volumes of our trade, of EU export in particular, they are not quite amazing as the values that are inflated by inflation results in the statistics. So we are losing weight and trade power competing with China, but also with the United States. The US are Atlantic ally at a military and perhaps political level, but they are our direct competitor in many areas. And if we continue business as usual, we will continue to lose this centrality, and as well as enterprises and capacity to create new businesses. And it's not through new colonies that we can recover this centrality, because I think that we can lose the only opportunity. We have to be the best interpreters, the more coherent, the more democratic of this historical phase. Or we have to change our approach. We have to empower our capacity to promote coherence, in particular, for instance, with opportunities like this one of today. We had to make our voice heard by two commissions, and not just in the DigiTrade, in the trade dialogue, or with the DEVE or with the other DGs, but all together to not to criticize for the sake of criticize, but to try together struggling in these particular and very difficult phases to find a solution and a way out together. And I think that we have the best expertises and also the best reputation with our partner countries and our partners organization to spend in order to rebuild this confidence and this perspective, the joint perspective in direction of a better future. Sorry to be the priest of the seminar.
Thank you, Monica. So you previously referred to the Green Deal. How much can we preserve its ambition? And so I was wondering also with the aim to involve Jeronim in our debate, I was wondering how well do standard economic models capture the benefits of the energy transition? We've also talked about the incentives. So this kind of econometric models, how much do they work? Do you have something to say about that?
Thank you. It's good to bring this up because it fell by the wayside during my 10 minutes. Not very well is the short answer. There are a lot of things that we can say, but what we really realize if we do like a proper global analysis, which we have done, which we do routinely every few years, we've done it. In 2019, under the banner of the Global Green New Deal, we've done it in 2022. We do realize that basically, given the needs of investment that are realistically required for the energy transition, we already know we're not really going to meet the challenge of even the most permissive IPCC scenarios. And so the question then becomes, what's the second best? And it's a complicated story because obviously there are technical issues and there are political priorities, and it's all very important. But what we do know for sure when we look into these things is the developing countries are under between a rock and a hard place. They're under a double pressure. On the one hand, it's a pressure to develop, which I've always had, and somehow, and this is mostly the fault of the WTO's shortcoming. This has always been an item that's been pushed down in the agenda. But also they're under pressure to decarbonize, so develop and decarbonize. But to develop, they need exports. They need exports in key strategic sectors, the dynamic sectors I said before. So they need a type of trade integration with the world that is conducive to the type of structural change they need that will allow ultimately for the better standards of living. But their exports are very energy intensive and their energy is very carbon intensive. And at the end of the day, what we find ourselves with is a trend in which to make sure that development happens and pave the way for it to happen, then we need to inevitably allow carbon-intensive trade flows, or trade flows that have a lot of embedded emissions in them. So in this sense, all the proposals like CBAM and other proposals to incentivize the reduction of this, from a very detailed perspective, they make sense because, of course, we want to use the incentives that we can to make sure we discourage the type of trade that we feel is not compatible with our goals. But if it doesn't come in a package that makes sure that while we constrain these countries' ability to get inflows of foreign currency with their trade, then we also allow them to get the free technology they need to move up in the transition to renewables, then we're only adding a very vicious constraint, and it's a tremendous injustice. I think it's easy to agree on that. So it's not very surprising that when we go in the COP meetings and when we talk about the loss and damage proposals, a lot of developing countries are are willing to block the discussions because they feel that their survival priority is not quite appreciated. And the models, I think the models help, but they help us see a reality that is, you know, is not being, it's not reflected in the policies we see today. And I think the most striking example of this is that when we look at the investment that we need to accomplish the energy transition, the transition towards renewables, then we realize that you know, there's going to have to be a big investment push. But every big investment push is not going to be only green investment. It's like when you build an electric car, the end result is an item that doesn't consume the type of energy you don't want to consume, but the process of building that ends up producing a lot of emissions. And so the investment push is going to add load onto the tolerance of the atmosphere. And because of how close we are to this points of no return, in some cases we're beyond points of no return, this blip is enough to send us over the edge. And so then the question becomes, because if we cannot afford a big blip, a big investment push synchronized, if that's the case, then who does it first? And how do we make sure that this is a concerted process that does not forget the priority of development? Because let's not make a mistake here that is often made. We talk about and this is something I think it becomes very clear when one looks at the macroeconomics of the climate discussion. The prosperity that we enjoy in parts of the world today, which is the prosperity we want to save by saving the planet, is a prosperity that exists because of the lack of prosperity in other parts of the world. So the interest or the expectation that the developing countries have in an energy transition that respects the development priority is very understandable. And that, I think, is a territory where we have to make a lot of progress.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if Alessia wants to add something. And in general, if the three speakers of ours want to make maybe a short closing remark.
But can I just wonder perhaps to react to the last interventions,
Please,
indeed, because we're talking about econometric model analysis of Green Deal, etc. I mean, of course, when we are preparing to start negotiations on new agreements, new partners, old partners, we have not only economic analysis of internal and economic analysis and impact assessment, we also have, of course, a sustainability impact assessments that as part of our EU trade policy, where we go in and look at economic, social, human rights and environmental impacts of the ongoing trade negotiations. That may indeed require an update to perhaps include more broader sort of let's say Green Deal aspects and potentially all this cross-border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM or CBAM or whatever name we give to it. So I think this is indeed part of our policies. And also because now the CBAM is mentioned several times, we have heard that there is an intense discussion indeed with the EU's partners in the southern neighborhood. We heard, for instance, in December when we at the Trade and Investment Forum of the Union for the Mediterranean, there was also a very intense discussion indeed there on the of the issues surrounded of the CBAM, but we heard more of an opening for discussion and understanding of it. It's not a protection measure. It's not a trade measure, and this is very important to underline. It is indeed a climate measure. And we are I'm saying the European Commission is engaging indeed with many of the countries in the region, some more than other intensively. Of course, it depends on their exports whether they actually, let's say, are affected by this mechanism. But there is an ongoing discussion there. So we just to say that we are in contact. I don't know if you want me to continue my conclusion.
Of
Then
course.
no, just I mean, thanks to my fellow panelists. I think it's very, very interesting indeed to hear about how we do it. I mean, first of all, how do we evaluate where to engage and with what to engage. I'm hearing from Jeronim that our partners' economies are moving towards sort of more manufacturing and low salary sectors, which I find perhaps slightly concerning. But I think also with indeed the digital and energy transition, I think there is potential indeed for sort of higher potential and higher salary sector to jobs. We hope, but of course that requires that there is actually a dialogue, requires that indeed that we find a mutual way of communicating between the countries. Indeed, it was raised also, I think, by Monica. We are dealing with a number of former EU colonies, way long time ago, but these countries are indeed, and that applies effectively both to the South Mediterranean and most of the African countries, is spreading that the countries are looking for win-win situations. They don't want to just get money and we dictate what they should be doing. This is very clear, and I think that we are also in a process also of the whole entire commission, and not only from a trade policy perspective, but also from the departments that provide the financial system, that provide budget support, that we enter into a dialogue about what is good for you, what is good for us, what is good for us together, and then we can throw some money in on that as well, if they still want the money, because of course that we've seen in one of the other cases that they send the money back. I think a lot to say. I've taken note of a number of things here. I think again from Monica, I mean, I really think that the potential of the trade and sustainability development chapters are there. I think also we can increase, if ever, sometime that we can find the right footing to discuss, and we can say basically surpass the political non-synergies. I mean, we need to find the political synergies clearly, and there are certain issues in one or the other countries from a trade perspective. As I said, the market access barriers are really an issue, but it's also sometimes higher, and it's a political dialogue to have. First of all, so it's not an easy process with the countries in the region, but indeed nearshoring, friendshoring, I think I personally agree to that. What my political masters say will need to be confirmed, but I think there's definitely still potential in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we all agree that political will is crucial to make changes. I'm wondering if Monica or Jeronim want to react, or in general to say something before we, please.
Yes, I jump to my conclusion, taking a bit of this latest intervention. Unfortunately, the impact assessment are set up in trade silos, so therefore the direct projection between market opening and job creation opportunities are often not accurate because they don't take into account a deep and comprehensive understanding, for instance, of social dynamics and economic dynamics. This is not a fault of the Commission, and we tried in the civil society dialogue to qualify the mandate and the framework for this evaluation in the latest years, always and always, and to better them. But it's very, I think I agree with Jeronim, it's a problem of model. If we don't change our model of evaluation and we use the same old model of the World Bank, I think that we will miss a lot of the picture. So I want to thank you for this facilitation, not easy facilitation, and the other panelists, and the opportunity that the engineer and the COSPE created for this discussion and I hope that we can build on it in order to create a more accurate and a more overall participation of the DC to the creation of a very comprehensive economic and investment agenda for the EU in the future. Otherwise, I think that a big part of the picture will be missing, and we will miss the opportunity of a real development for all, and of a real, reconfiguration of the economy as a tool and not as a final goal. That is not. So thank you so much. Always the priest, unfortunately, but I don't know why I put myself in this corner, but in any case, thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Monica. Jeronim, would you like to ask something before?
No, nothing further.
No.
I'm good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. So it has been a pleasure to listen to you and to share this debate. We're waiting for the next one, but in the meanwhile, I wish you a nice day. Thanks to the audience. Thanks for participating to the polls and for listening to us. I wish you a nice day. Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.